Well, anyways, let's move forward with the kind of area touching upon the social aspects. In your latest article, Can't Touch With, you mentioned something very powerful, I think. And let me quote you here. It's a longer sentence. You said, or you kind of asked, if someone finds that the golden ratio of ergonomics, haptic fidelity, and cost, will haptics be liberatory, restorative, and humanizing? Or will it ultimately prove to confine, exploitative, and dehumanizing? And then you voiced skepticism about this humanizing and liberating aspects. Well, have you thought about ways of making it more humane then, or possibly ways of protecting future users from harmful consequences?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think part of the problem is it goes back to something that you just brought up a second ago, which is we don't know how this is going to look once it gets out into the wild, right? So I think the way that we answer those questions depends on the form it takes once if it gets out into the world in like any sort of like mass, at any sort of mass scale. What does the technology look like in that instance? And I think that will give us a clue as to how we answer some of these questions. But I also don't think it's too early to start thinking about ethics in haptics technology. And I think the field of haptics is a radically interdisciplinary field. It's one of the things that's always fascinated me about it. It's got tributaries from all over: robotics, psychophysics, engineering. It's got all these different fields of research that are necessary in order to make the technology work at all, right? Just because haptics is so hard to get right. And the one thing that has been sort of dramatically absent for me in the literature is any discussion of ethics, any discussions of privacy, very minimal discussions of consent. And you can make the argument that it's still too early to do that. That the technology is not necessarily mature enough that we need to be asking those questions. But my concern there is that if you don't ask those questions early enough, then they won't be baked into the design from the start.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I mean, I think at some point we'll get to a place where we need to talk about what are sort of baseline ethical standards for haptics research, for haptics technology. Do we limit the type of data that we collect on users when they're using an interface? And I know some companies that I've spoken to have been very enthusiastic about the ability of their devices to capture biometric data about their users. That scares me, right? That capturing biometric data is baked into the financial model, the commercial model of the technology. That's really troublesome. And I think it speaks to, the sort of umbrella issue here, which is that all this technological development is happening within, a capitalist ecosystem where products have to ultimately make money and produce a return on investment, right? So what does it mean for Meta to be funneling money into haptics research? How are they hoping to monetize or recoup that investment? That's really, concerning to me, given if we're looking at that company in particular, given their ethical issues around data collection, with Facebook and with Instagram. Yeah, so
it's like we're giving away our most private parts, the leftovers, right? Our bodies, and it's just scary. It's scary how it can be potentially used. And going back to also why we need to talk about ethics early on, right? Even from the perspective of like utilitarian design process, it's very important to talk about ethics right away. Like I'm teaching this course right now, and I gave this article to my students during this design process. Like they have their projects, they have to design some wearable technology using haptic feedback. And I told them, guys, please read this article and think about those implications, because it also influences about the form factor, how you provide the inputs versus output, right? Small things like this, but it's also about privacy, how you place the motors, where they're located, and what kind of data you're gathering and why. And also, how do you educate the users about these issues, about the possibility of their data being stolen or misused? That's very, very important. Well, let's then close up the conversation with my last question for you. So, which is related to learning from the past, you know, the classical question about the history in general. So, can you tell me, can the historical genetics and evolution of tactile interfaces predict the future of haptics, or maybe can it help us to learn from the mistakes? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, so prediction is tough, right?
Right, yeah.
And there have been, anyone who gives a timeline for haptics technology will probably get it wrong. You know, so I think that is, for me, it's really fascinating not to try to do prediction, but to try to look at prediction, to try to look at to try to learn from past predictions. For instance, one of my favorite examples of this is Howard Rheingold in his book Virtual Reality. He's writing about teledildonics. He's writing about like cyber sex, remote sex technologies in 1990. And he says that basically, like in 30 years, we may all have these, like he calls them portable telediddlers that we carry around with us, and basically like remote sex has become normalized. And so Rheingold, like he gave a date, right? He said 30 years out. And
he was wrong.
He was wrong, but he wasn't entirely wrong, right? So it's not that it's not been ubiquitously deployed, but I would say of all the areas of haptics research, and you know, haptics researchers like to treat that area of haptics like at a little bit of arm's length, right? But I would say that that's one area where we've seen like the successful commercialization of haptics technologies is in the area of cyber sex. It's not ubiquitous, but it's more ubiquitous than like haptic gloves are, for instance, for sure, right? So Rheingold, the point is Rheingold gave a date, and we could, you know, we can look back and say like, oh, he got this right, he got this wrong. But I think it's interesting. What's more instructive is to try to learn from those predictions, right? To try to learn from what people were thinking when they made a prediction, to try to learn where they might have gone wrong. So, you know, if we look back at the discourse around haptics, the marketing discourse around haptics from the late 1990s, when Logitech is selling force feedback, little vibrating computer mice, early 2000s. Microsoft is partnering with Immersion and developing like force feedback racing steering wheels. The rhetoric, the description of what those technologies were going to do, how they were going to transform gaming, is almost word for word the same as you find in marketing language for contemporary haptic vests, haptic gloves, right? So was that necessarily the best pitch? Did they set themselves up for failure by overpromising? I sort of think that one of the problems that the industry has had for a long time is it has overpromised, right? It's ratcheted the rhetoric up so high that the products it releases can't possibly deliver on that, deliver on those promises. It can't possibly cash the check that was written around it, because they've said that it's going to do so much, right?
Yeah, but maybe they also drive the interest, right? And motivation for further research or some developments. Might be not in a good direction, who knows? But, you know, the money is brought to the industry anyway, so some part of it could be used for a good, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. We can also look, seems like we can look back at a lot of those devices and see how they, you know, how and why they fell short, or look at the way that people reacted to them, maybe the way that people used them in ways that the designers didn't necessarily intend to. And I'll just give a quick example here. So the Novent Falcon is one of my favorite historical examples of, you know, haptics device successfully brought to market. You could go to Walmart or Best Buy and buy one off the shelf, right? They had them, they had them pretty widely distributed in stores. Novint was asking people to be haptics evangelists. They were asking people basically to host like Tupperware parties for the Falcon, where you'd invite a bunch of your friends over and you would show them how the device worked. And that would generate this sort of grassroots groundswell of interest in the device and in haptics more generally. And you would end up with, this thing being widely deployed as a, as a gaming controller. The device fails, like dramatically fails, right? Doesn't, the company folds. They're closing out the devices for like $50 at Best Buy. But what does it do? It puts very cheap haptic interfaces in the hands of a lot of people who then start playing and doing creative things with the technology, right? So it's failure, but it's also a generative failure that I think can be interesting to look back on and see where the interest clustered. Was the interest that emerged in the places that the designers and the marketers thought it would be, or did people do something creative and unexpected with technology at the grassroots level? And I think that's kind of been missing from the history of haptics. We haven't quite seen that like tinkerer hacker level of interest in the technology, I think, until just the past like 5 or 10 years or so. But for the most part, it's been a very elite controlled field. In other words, like people working in university context, people working in industry context, not necessarily like on the ground users tinkering with the technology, trying to do something cool and interesting with it.
So you think that could be in a way like partially a future of haptic, right? These grassroots DIY communities, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So basically give haptics to people.
See what they do with it. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. I think we can basically end on this note. Thank you for your conversation, really, and thanks for your time and sharing your experience, your thoughts, your ideas. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been a really fun conversation. Appreciate it.